Thank you for joining, everybody. I have Jo Ivester here. She is an author. She is a freedom fighter, y'all. So let's get right into this interview and see what she has to say. Jo, go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, I love the label freedom fighter because I really feel that that's just a description that fills me with joy because that is
Yes.
how I see myself. Back in 1967, when I was 10 years old, my father joined the war on poverty.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the way I think of it. He was a doctor in Massachusetts, in Boston, and we had a pretty easy life. We were in a good school district. I have two older brothers and an older sister. We grew up in a loving home where we always had food on the table, a shelter overhead. We had friends, we had family. Life was easy and good.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad started to want to do something more. And he found out about an opportunity in Mississippi where they were looking for a physician to run the startup of a new clinic.
Okay.
And he basically said, okay, I'll do that.
Wow.
And he told our family and presented it to us as this incredible adventure and opportunity. I was 10 years old and I totally believed him, and I felt like this was an opportunity to be a part of something bigger than ourselves, something important. And so within a few months, we left our beautiful home in Boston to live in a trailer in Mount Bayou, Mississippi. So let me tell you a little bit about Mount Bayou. So Mount Bayou is an incredible town for anybody who hasn't heard of it. It is historic. It is the largest, oldest all-black town in the country. It was formed by former slaves. It was entirely owned by its black population, which was very unusual. And what property ownership allowed the people of Mount Bayou to do was to essentially create their own commercial development, a middle class, if you would. Recently, we just, I don't want to use the word celebrated, but remembered the 100th anniversary of the 1921 racial war against the black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where there was a thriving middle class with bankers, with lawyers, with educated people, with lots of stores. Mount Bayou was the same way. So for anybody who's been following the story of Tulsa lately, picture that for Mount Bayou, except in a more rural setting. It was out in the middle of the cotton fields. By the time I lived there, it was 1,300 people. At its height, it had 8,000 people. And it was considered what we call the safe haven. The KKK stayed away. So it was a town that was populated by, run by, and protected by its black community.
Wow.
And they had a hospital, they had banks, they had stores, they had schools. They'd written a grant request, and as part of Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty, they'd gotten funding to build a brand new high school.
Oh my goodness.
So this is what this community had created. But the medical care for the residents, the black residents of the Mississippi Delta, was still very limited. So they did have the hospital in town, and it was fantastic. And I know people who, for generations before them, that's where they were born. But the hospitals in the nearby towns, they either wouldn't take black patients at all, or if they did, they made them wait until the end of the day when all the white patients had been seen. Pregnant mothers ready to deliver would have to stand in line outside at the back door, waiting to deliver, and sometimes run out of time. When they were treated in these white hospitals, the black community they weren't respected. The black doctors the white doctors would in some cases just interview patients and ask them questions and wouldn't perform physical examinations. because they didn't want to have the physical contact.
Mm.
So that was why there was a need for greater medical resources than they had, even though what they had was really powerful. And we were fortunate enough that they accepted us into the town. We were white, we were outsiders, we were Northerners. And it took a while for us to prove ourselves and gain acceptance, but we were eventually very generously pulled into the community. And we lived there for 2 years, and I can go into a lot more stories about that, and it's covered a lot of it in my first book,
Yes.
The Outskirts of Hope,
Yes.
which really covers our whole family story, not just mine. It actually focuses on my mother, who became a school teacher there.
Mhm.
And just by living there, we were pulled into the civil rights movement.
Wow.
And to fast forward through all the stories, which I would love to share, but I'm going to wait for your questions to do so, that 2 years living in Mound Bayou gave me, I would say, 3 important items or attributes. One is an awareness. If I had stayed in Boston and grown up there, I would have read in the newspapers about discrimination and prejudice and the difficulties faced by our communities of color, but it wouldn't have been personal. By living in Mound Bayou, by the friendships that I developed as a child and that I still maintain today as
Wow.
my closest friends.
That is
That
incredible.
experience, it is, and it gave me an awareness.
Wow.
You've read the book My Friend Clarence. I just sent him a text the other day. We've invited each other to our kids' weddings. It's never worked out that we could come, but we were close enough to be invited. When I've gone back to Mississippi, partly as research for my book or to share with my family what my childhood experience was, it's Clarence that housed me. He said, "You're not staying in any hotel." So that's how close we are. His
Wow.
daughter came and visited me in Texas
That's
and spent hours.
but you're telling me that your awareness was developed with exposure or through exposure. And
Yes,
in today's political climate where you have so much divide, did you see the map when the presidential election was complete? It was red and it was blue, right? It was split in half. So do
yes.
you think that more exposure personally to a marginalized demographic creates cohesion and inclusivity? Do you think that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that kids have to grow up together.
Right.
And there are lots of different ways of making that happen. But right now, um, well, I live in Austin, Texas, and we're one of the most, even though we are a liberal town, kind of an oasis within Texas, as are other major cities like Houston and Dallas and San Antonio. So very split with the red suburbs, the red rural areas, and the blue cities.
Mhm.
But even given that, we're very segregated.
Wow.
And it's not accidental. It's intentional. In the 1900s, the Black population of Austin was basically forced to move to one part of town.
Wow. Wow.
To if they didn't move, they had their power cut off by the city. This was intentional. And then we had the banks redlining. And I don't know if your listeners are familiar with that, and I don't want to make this a history lesson, but redlining was a way that banks basically refused loans
Wow.
to Black applicants, and so they couldn't get mortgages, and so they couldn't have home ownership, which was a strength in Mound Bayou. They could, and so they haven't been able to develop the same personal wealth in the way of savings by being part of the housing market.
Wow.
And that's here in my hometown of Boston. We have that kind of separation. So there's a separation of living. So that means that kids grow up to a large extent in classrooms where there are Black students or Hispanic students or other communities of color in some schools and not in others. There are certainly exceptions.
Mhm.
And schools have tried all kinds of things, but it hasn't worked yet. So our kids are still growing up separate. They
Right.
don't have the exposure that I did. Some do, but on average they don't. If you're white, chances are pretty good your neighbors are white, and chances are pretty good that your classmates are largely white.
Mm.
And so you don't develop this kind of natural comfort and recognition that people who look different from you really aren't different from you. That race is, to use some of the current terminology, a structure that's been added in, that we have very different experiences because our society has created that. But scientifically, a black person and a white person are basically the same, and our kids need to grow up knowing that. And
Exactly.
I don't buy that. I want to be very careful that I'm not suggesting erasing the differences that people have experienced and lived, because those are very, very real because of discrimination and prejudice implemented not accidentally but on purpose.
It's going to be so powerful, this transition here to me, because we have a group, a family of freedom fighters, right? And this family of freedom fighters has a child that's transitioning. And I want you to talk a little bit about that book, and I want you to talk about your experience, how you felt after even having the experience with the Black community as well. How did that help you? Did it hinder you? Go ahead and talk about that.
Sure. Well, I started to say the three things I got out of Mississippi. One was awareness, another was courage. That
Mm.
I got through that experience as a stronger, better person,
Mhm.
and realized that even though some really difficult things happened for my family, for our community, for our country during those years, that we could get through it together. And that gave me a courage. And the third was recognizing that individuals can make a big difference. So my parents are heroes to me.
Yeah.
That when I went back to Mount Bayou and interviewed people, folks talked about how 40 years earlier they'd been my dad's patients or my mother's students and how it had impacted their life.
Mm.
So I come out of all that with it being a part of who I am as a parent. And then when my son is in his early 20s, he shares with me that he's figuring out who he really is and his gender identity, and that he's transgender. And together we picked the name Jeremy, which is a whole nother story, the opportunity to pick your child's name with them a second time. So
Wow.
how does that tie back to his childhood? There's a regret. Because if I had known when he was 4 years old what I know today about what it means to be transgender, I would have taken those lessons from Mississippi of awareness, of courage, and of knowing I could make a difference. And I would have been an advocate back in the early 90s. And I would have given my son the childhood and teenage years that he deserved. But because I was clueless, I didn't think to ask his school counselor or his doctors or anybody who might know what's going on with my kid. And so I viewed him as mom. I said, I have a tomboy. And that's what he called himself. And we didn't know that we were thinking about two different things. In my head, I used the word tomboy in a very traditional sense. It's how I viewed myself as a kid, that I was very active and played with boys and wore my hair short and didn't like putting on a dress.
Right.
It didn't mean that I knew inside I was a boy. I knew inside I was a girl, but I called myself a tomboy. When Jeremy called himself a tomboy, he viewed it like a special kind of boy, that he was a boy, but he knew that anatomically he looked different and that his reproduction system was different.
Right.
So we didn't communicate. And I look at that now and say, how did I not know? And of course I didn't know because no one else had shared their stories.
Right.
Or very few people. That's why I share our story.
Wow.
It's so that all those parents out there who want to support their kids, want to love their kids, want to give them the childhood they deserve, but don't know how to do that, can read our story and say, oh, wow, that sounds like my kid.
Right.
And then our next generation will be more supported and respected and taken care of. And that's one population I want to reach. And then I want to reach all the folks that maybe don't have someone trans in their life, but need to understand so that they can support and accept and recognize it's a big deal if someone can be thrown out of their home because their landlord realizes they're trans and says, I don't want someone trans living in my apartment.
Mm.
My son could lose his apartment
Wow.
if some landlord decided they didn't like him being trans. Until recently, you could get fired for being trans. We just had a Supreme Court case that said, no, you can't. But we still don't have enough protection.
Right.
So that's why I'm an advocate. And the third piece of it was when I realized just how desperate the situation is, that 40% of trans teenagers, more than 40%, have tried to die by suicide. And they haven't just thought about it, they've actually tried. And I know people who found out their kid is trans with essentially a suicide note that was left behind that said, I can't deal with this dysphoria anymore. In that particular case, the child lived. So the dad had gone home from the hospital to pick up some clothing from the child's bedroom and found the note and realized why this suicide action had taken place.
Right. Wow. That's incredible that you said that the reason you share your story is to make other people aware, and the reason you did not know how to respond to your son was because there were no stories available. That is amazing, and that is the core reason why I started doing interviews on this channel, so that other people's stories could encourage and provide information for folks that are not aware.
Yeah.
That's so phenomenal. Now, how did the rest of your family handle your son while he was transitioning? What happened there?
Oh, so many things. I am so proud of Jeremy's brothers and sister.
Oh.
I would say from the beginning, there was never a question of love and never a question of support. It took a while to gain understanding and to recognize that being transgender is a real thing. So that some of the initial reaction was, can't he? They were using right pronouns, but can't he just adjust and adapt? Why does he have to do surgery, for example? Why do something as difficult and painful? Just accept that, okay, I'm a man, but happen to have this body that doesn't match. So there wasn't an understanding of what dysphoria means, and there was a desire to protect. But there was always a sense of love. And I think one of the hardest things was that for Jeremy, as for many trans individuals, it wasn't a straight line from point A to point B.
Right. I've heard.
It was a gradual figuring things out, kind of 2 steps toward, yeah, I'm trans, and then, no, that can't be what I am, and then moving forward. And the same was true for actions. Oh, I can't wear dresses anymore. Well, maybe I could. Well, no, I can't. And his siblings felt like, if you just came out and said it, then we'd accept it. But we're trying to follow you on this path that is zigzagging us all over the place. So just tell us what you need from us and we'll do it. That was a frustration for siblings. But over time, they realized that, we just had to follow Jeremy's lead, and that wasn't going to be one step forward, and the next step forward, that it was going to be this meandering path. Now, everyone's path is different. So some trans kids, they know at 4 years old that they're trans. They make a statement and they start living their authentic lives. And in some ways, that's easier for the siblings and the parents because it's just there. In other cases, it's more like my son, where he didn't know, and so he couldn't share that with the siblings. When Jeremy was 23 years old, that's when everything kind of came to a head. And he had read about it and seen on TV examples of transgender people, and he pushed that down. He was in denial, saying, they're really miserable and I'm basically happy, so I can't be trans.
Right.
That was one thing. Or, I'm basically happy and change is so difficult, I can't change. And I don't want to disappoint people. All of that was going on in his head, so he just pushed that down. And instead what he did was present very androgynously. So that looking at him, you would see what might be a 14-year-old boy instead of a 23-year-old adult. And it wasn't until you would hear him speak that you would say, oh, wait, maybe this isn't a boy, or it's a boy who hasn't hit puberty yet, because his voice wasn't low yet. So this is how he was presenting. And in the midst of this, his big sister asked him to be her maid of honor. And he said yes, thinking, this is so cool, we're so close as family members, and of course I want to make my big sister happy, and this is what sisters do, because he hadn't yet accepted that he was a brother. So he said yes, and almost immediately realized, oh, wait a minute, there's a whole bunch of stuff that comes with being maid of honor. It's very, very female presenting. Specifically a maid of honor gown. So my daughter, my oldest, was envisioning a large wedding party, and all the bridesmaids and the maid of honor dressed in complimentary gowns to the wedding gown. So she was picturing this, and Jeremy was getting more and more scared that he had said yes, and the implication that he'd have to wear this dress when he hadn't worn a dress in 5 years. And at the time that he was wrestling with that, he started sharing with his dad and me, so we knew he was wrestling and that he was really torn up about it. And we're saying, tell your sister, figure something out. No, I can't tell her yet. So we couldn't go talk to big sister because it wasn't our story to share.
Right.
All we could do was encourage Jeremy to do it. Well, finally, when it was just a few weeks before the wedding, and it was just, Jeremy couldn't sleep. He was feeling anxiety and real trauma over this upcoming event. He called his sister, and he didn't explain why, but he said, I can't wear the dress. And he proposed that instead he wear the same slacks as all the men in the wedding party, and a dress shirt and a vest that he would have made that would match the color of the bridesmaids' dresses. And his big sister said yes. And that's how Jeremy dressed for the wedding and stood by his sister's side. And it was this incredible acceptance. Well, fast forward a few months, we had a second big wedding. So Jeremy's big brother was getting married, and big brother's fiance at the time, now my daughter-in-law of 8 years, said, you know what, just dress like the men and stand at Ben's side. You're still one of the bridesmaids, but because that's what's in the program that's already printed up, but just dress like the men. Yeah. And so that's what Jeremy did. And again, the acceptance, even though we didn't know what we were accepting, was there. A month after that second wedding, Jeremy had top surgery. And as a parent, it was terrifying to me that any of my kids would have surgery. Right. That setting aside why he was needing the surgery, just I didn't want him to go through it, and didn't really believe the need, though even I read the literature, I knew that medically this was considered a very good way medically of dealing with gender dysphoria, is to have top surgery. But I didn't want him to do it because I didn't want the risks. I didn't want the pain and the recovery. But it was his decision to make, and so I had to support it. So I met up with him in Florida, where he'd scheduled his surgery. We stayed in a hotel room because they did the surgery as day surgery, because they were trying to keep the costs down because insurance didn't cover it. And then they trained me how to take care of him, how to drain the tubes, how to manage the pain medication, how to keep the area clean. Stuff that should have been done in a hospital, and I learned how to do it in a hotel room. And for a week, I took care of my son.
Wow.
And we talked, and he talked about, am I really trans? I don't know. Surgery was to address a gender dysphoria with physical appearance, but I think this is all I'm going to do. But in those conversations, he said, what if? What if I am? What if I decide to publicly announce I'm a man? What name should I take? And so we got to talk during that week about his name.
Wow.
And he didn't tell me he'd accepted it. I just knew that he was thinking about it, and that we'd come up with something he liked. Well, about a month or two after surgery, he realized this wasn't enough. That he'd look at himself in the mirror, he'd be really happy with his masculine profile on his upper body, but then he'd look at the curviness of the rest of his body and at his high voice and his lack of facial hair, and he would look at trans men who had been on hormones, or at cisgender men who had been born with a male anatomy, and he would say, I want that. That's really what I need. And I'm not going to get that if I don't go on hormones. So I didn't realize it, but he had gone back to his therapist, and they worked through it, and he decided that the time had come to accept himself. And so he did. And he announced on Facebook, basically. It was the first time I knew that he was going to take the name Jeremy. And he posted saying, hi, everybody. You may have noticed that my name is different. Please start calling me Jeremy, and use male pronouns. And I'm going to start taking hormones, which will put me through a male puberty, and my voice will deepen, and I might get some facial hair. Bye. And
wow.
that it was done. I then posted almost immediately. I was already a writer and a speaker, so I wanted to make an impactful statement. So I posted that I was so proud to announce that I now had 3 sons, and that Jeremy, I kind of repeated what he had said about himself, and I said that we were so proud of him, that he was the bravest, most courageous person I know, and that we had been on the path with him the whole way and would remain by his side wherever his journey took him.
Wow.
And I posted that, and I didn't expect it to, but it went viral. And I started getting Facebook messages from friends of friends of friends. And at first they were all really positive. They were primarily from people somewhere on the LGBTQ spectrum, thanking me for being accepting as a mom.
Yes.
Feeling like, okay, yeah, I'm super mom here, pat on the back, this is great. But then the messages took on a darker tone, that somehow they had gotten into the Facebook community of some transgender men who saw themselves in Jeremy and Jeremy in them. And they wrote to me and shared with me that when they'd come out to their families at 15, 16 years old, that they'd been kicked out and lived on the street. And I answered every one of those, said, I don't know you. I might really know you better at some time. I hope I do, but please know that there's one more person in the world now that cares about you. And I tried to be mom to anybody who wrote to me.
Mm.
And that was when I decided to really research how hard it was for the trans community. And when I found out, for example, about the suicide and the homelessness and getting kicked out and the rejection from church groups and just the pain of gender dysphoria, that's when I decided I had to become an advocate.
Right.
And that's when I decided that I wanted to use my writing and speaking skills to share our own family story.
Wow. What an incredible story. I want to know specifically how Jeremy's relationship with his father impacted his confidence.
So Jeremy's dad is great, my husband. We've been married for over 40 years. We met as college undergraduates in a theater group of all things.
Mhm.
And while we were engineering and science majors. So folks with our whole theater group was made up of scientists and mathematicians who loved Shakespeare.
Right.
And so we acted together for years, and I still get together with that group every Monday night to read a play aloud.
Wow.
We started doing that with the pandemic. So starting by saying Jeremy's dad, John, is amazing as a husband and as a father, and he's been an incredible support to all of his kids. So he actually did more research than I did. He's
Wow.
always enjoyed reading about natural history. He enjoyed his biology and chemistry classes. I was on the physics and math side. So he was intrigued intellectually
Mm.
in a very deep way, and so he was educating me. And I would go to the web pages that Jeremy was looking at, and as a total layperson would read them and learn. But John was looking at it as a scientist and saying, everything Jeremy's saying, this is medically correct. He's got good information. So that was just a big support to me, making me more comfortable. But John wasn't as public in his support as I was. He was an executive with a high-tech company, and he felt that it was important for him to not make what he viewed as political statements, because he didn't want to make people on his staff or other people in the company feel at all uncomfortable. He's changed. I want to say that up front. But
You know what? That's an honest way to be. I think that, a lot of times we have to have realistic expectations for parents, right?
yes,
And I think there was nothing wrong with that in his journey to supporting his son.
well, exactly. But it changed. And the way it changed was about 3 years after Jeremy had really started sharing with us and had changed his name legally. He was well into his physical transition. John and I had the opportunity to speak at a dinner with the Anti-Defamation League, where we were given, between the two of us, 8 minutes to address about 500 or 600 people. And it included a lot of my husband's colleagues, as well as many members of our community that had watched our kids grow up, and we'd watched their kids grow up. So folks that knew us but might not know our story, our personal story. And going into it, John said, you know what, the time has come. He realized that by not making public statements, he was missing an opportunity to be supportive of his own work environment. That we eventually started our bumpers, car bumpers, for example, never had anything on them. And then we put an equality sticker on. And so many employees came by and thanked him.
Wow.
And shared with them that either they or someone in their life was someone somewhere on the LGBTQ spectrum, and that they appreciated his open support. And I thought, God, I could have been doing that all these years. But in any case, he chose this ADL dinner. And when he stood up, he was explaining how our mission as a family match so well with the Anti-Defamation League's mission, which is to provide, in addition to fighting against anti-Semitism, it fights for the freedom and justice for everybody.
Right.
They recognize that you couldn't fight against anti-Semitism without fighting for everybody who was discriminated against. 100-year-old organization that's been in the midst of that. So he announced, my son is trans, to this room of 600 people. And our family was all there for this dinner. So we had a table that had all our kids and their partners, and my dad's wife. My dad had passed, but his wife came, wife of 30 years came, and her brother. So we're all sitting there together. And by the time John finished talking about his son being trans and how the trans community was discriminated against and how proud he was of Jeremy and that he loved Jeremy, I don't think there was anyone in the room that wasn't choked up.
Wow.
And as we started to leave the stage, there was a lot of applause and people standing, and we could see people choked up. And we started to make our way back to our own table where Jeremy was, and Jeremy didn't wait. He got up from the table and he met us halfway there. And he and John embraced. And I tell you, if anyone hadn't already been choked up, they got choked up seeing
I'm getting choked up.
So that's my husband's journey. Now he is with me on advocacy stuff. Monday, this coming Monday, the two of us together are going to be at the Texas State Capitol testifying because there's a special session of the legislature that's been called to, among other things, try to ban trans youth from playing sports in schools. So we're fighting that very actively, and John will be there. We'll both testify. So that's the dad's perspective, and he joins me in counseling parents who have newly found out that their kid is trans.
Wow.
Because
where can we find that information? How to contact you for that?
So my email address, which you're welcome to share, is joe@joeivester.com. And folks can reach me either through that or through my webpage, my author webpage, which is www.joeivester.com.
Wow.
And I will respond to any outreach. And if it's local, we counsel one-on-one or two-on-two or whatever, or we'll Zoom meeting. And in a lot of cases, people expect the mom to be accepting. Our society expects that.
Right.
They don't know that the dad will. So especially in situations where the parents come to us or the mom comes to us and says, I love my kid, I support my kid, I believe my kid, but my husband is having more trouble, I'll bring John with us for coffee. And so he can talk dad to dad. And that works. And so he's just a really key part of our advocacy work.
This is incredible for me to listen to and to hear. And I am so grateful that you came on the show today. I'm going to post all of your books on this YouTube. I'm going to post your website as well as the email address to get a hold of you if someone needs counseling about their own children's transitions. Wow. I don't have anything left. This is a phenomenal story, and Jeremy is so lucky to have the both of you.
Thank you. We are lucky to have him.
Yes.
You know, it is. Parents ask me sometimes, do I have regrets? And I spoke about my regrets that we didn't know earlier. I have no regrets that Jeremy is transgender. It is. He is so much happier now. He is flourishing, and it was a matter of accepting who he is, and that's just been so remarkable to see. And I feel incredibly fortunate to have been pulled into this community, to have just learned about a part of our population that I knew nothing about, and I feel so connected to now, and like I can be mom to a lot of people.
Yeah.
It is fulfilling and satisfying and totally unexpected at this point in my life.
Yes, absolutely. So again, thank you so much for this. And I want to wish everybody a good rest of your week. Make sure you check out her website, get all of her books, as well as reach out to her if you have any questions about your kids transitioning, or if you're a trans person who wants to have your mom listen to Miss Joe, that would be a good idea as well. All right. So that's going to be it for today's show. You guys stay blessed out there. Bye bye.